Welcome, everybody, to the latest episode of The American Founding, a podcast about early American history, political philosophy, and the United States Constitution. I'm your host, Jay Cost. Welcome to those who are watching live through Grove City College on Zoom. Those of you who are watching on Twitter or X, and also those of you who are listening to the podcast on your podcast streamer. Before we get started at tonight's episode, I want to tell you a little bit about Grove City College. It ranks among the best colleges and universities in both Pennsylvania and the United States of America. It fosters intellectual, moral, spiritual, and social development consistent with a Christian worldview. It advocates individual freedom and personal responsibility. It seeks to preserve America's political, economic, and religious heritage. And it is one of the few institutions in the country that is independent of federal oversight because it accepts no federal funding, not even for financial student aid, which allows it to reflect the values that it wants to reflect. So you can learn more at faithandfreedom.com. All right, well, welcome back to this week's episode. Just as a review, what have we been looking at? 2 weeks ago, or I should say probably better put 2 episodes ago, we looked at the compromise over the United States Senate, which was a grand bargain between the large states and the small states. The last episode, we looked at the compromise over slavery, which was, I don't know if I would go so far as to call it a grand bargain, but it was really, in many respects, a decision to give a carve out to the South for the sake of national unity. There's really no other way to put it. That's really what the compromise on slavery is. The North doesn't really get anything in the compromise except the assent of the South to the Constitution. This week, we're going to look at the Electoral College. Now, these 3 subjects, the Senate, apportionment, slavery, and the Electoral College, all have a similar kind of sentiment to them, in my opinion, in that they don't necessarily, at first blush, make a lot of sense to modern readers of the Constitution. You know, the Senate, when you think about the Senate and the apportionment in the Senate, it doesn't seem very democratic, so I wanted to dig into that a little bit more deeply. The compromise over slavery definitely is not democratic, and I wanted to dig in that more deeply. And now looking at the Electoral College. The Electoral College is probably the most misunderstood aspect of the Constitution, and the Electoral College has gotten a lot of criticism over the last 25 years in basically because, frankly, we've had 2 presidential elections where somebody wins an electoral college majority without a popular vote majority, and so it becomes controversial. But even then, the criticism of the Electoral College is really kind of misplaced, and which is not to say that it's wrong. But when you dig into the Electoral College, what people are actually criticizing is the apportionment of presidential voting power. They're not really criticizing the Electoral College. The Electoral College, really, the way to think about the Electoral College as much as anything is kind of like a vestigial organ that's attached to the United States Constitution. It doesn't really have any meaningful power or function anymore. And it was an idea that did not work. It did not work almost right away. And we're going to talk about that. But I think the Electoral College, even though it doesn't work, it does really serve to help us understand what the framers were thinking about here. And what they're thinking about here is they want a strong presidency, or maybe put a strong-ish presidency. There's disagreements, and when we get into later episodes and we start talking about political divisions in the 1790s, which are going to be formative in creating the American founding, those disagreements on the scope of presidential power are going to be really important. But there is a general consensus at the Constitutional Convention that there has to be some sort of executive with meaningful power. And this is Alexander Hamilton, I think, probably wrote the one of the most important essays on presidential power. James Madison doesn't really have a lot of insight to offer us on the nature of presidential power. He's really more of a theorist on the legislative power. and maybe also like a big picture kind of guy of how a republic should look. When you want to understand the logic of a presidential office, especially like ours, Hamilton's the guy. Okay, and in Federalist 70, and it's a really good essay. If you have occasion to read it, I recommend it. Federalist 70, Alexander Hamilton says, this is a quote, "Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government." Now, that in and of itself, in the context of 1788, when he's writing that, is a little controversial. I mean, he sort of takes it as, a lot of people say that we need a weak executive, and he says, no, actually, what we need is a strong executive. And he gives several reasons, and all of these are going to be quotes. First, quote, "It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks," end quote. So basically, foreign policy and also management of the military. Second, it is not, quote, "It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws," end quote. The president is in charge of making sure the law is faithfully executed. Three, and this is where things get, I think, very interesting. Quote, "To the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice," end quote. And here's four, which is related. Quote, "To the security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy." Those are both really interesting. Let's break these down. The first two, the administration of the laws and management of foreign policy, the absence of that was definitely felt during the period under the Articles of Confederation. There was no person in charge of foreign affairs. There was no commander-in-chief in the same sense we have now. Washington's commander of the army, but we don't have somebody in the civilian government who's also over the military government. There's kind of a vacuum there. And we also, during the period under the Articles, state governors are in charge of administering federal national laws. So obvious. Okay, but what about 3 and 4? Protection of property against irregular and high-handed combinations, and then security of liberty against enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy. So what I really want to zoom in here is this idea of faction, because all of this, Hamilton mentions factions, but he talks about combinations, ambition, anarchy, but faction. Okay, what he's doing here is really kind of launching a shot across the legislative bow. Okay, what he's really getting at here is that when you leave legislative assemblies to their own devices, they will form factions that will endanger private property, and they will also endanger liberty itself. Now, Madison and Hamilton, although they are going to have deep and profound disagreements on the nature of executive power, they both agree on this. Madison's whole idea of the extended republic is to tamp down on the problem of factions. But there is still a feeling, Madison shares this, Hamilton's expressing it very clearly in Federalist 70, that there has to be somebody or some institution over and above the legislature. Okay, that's where they're coming from here. They were very serious about this too. And you can appreciate how serious they are because they gave this individual, the president, the power of the veto. Now, the veto authority originated in Great Britain. However, the king, during the crisis leading up to the American Revolution, had abused the veto authority over the colonial governments. You actually, if you read the Declaration of Independence, you see Jefferson mention this at several points. I think it's actually the first of the enumerated, like Jefferson's building his case against the king, and that's his first point. He's withheld his sanction to necessary laws. And in Great Britain, the sovereign had not exercised the veto authority since Queen Anne, and she died all the way back in 1714. So and I think she did that in like 1706. So it's been 80 years since the British sovereign exercised veto authority. And they're bringing that back to America. Now we're going to talk a little bit later on about the powers of the executive branch like the veto. But the point that I'm trying to get at here is this consensus view that there has to be not just somebody to administer the laws, not just somebody to make sure that foreign affairs and the military power are run efficiently, but there also has to be somebody to keep an eye on what Congress is doing. The president has to somehow be above the high-handed combinations, as Hamilton, of ambition and a faction. And that means in turn that he cannot be a party to them. He's got to be above them. And that's where the problem comes into play, or a problem, I should say. That's the way to think about this. The president somehow, in exercising the veto authority, has to be above the factions within Congress. How does he do that? Okay, well, it requires at least two things to make that happen, in the framers' view. The first, he cannot depend upon Congress to secure his term. Right? If the president needs the approval of Congress to continue in office, he is not going to provide any kind of check over Congress. He will be a creature of Congress. The other thing is that he has to be an individual of virtue and generally wisdom, and he has to see himself. Sort of the idea here of sort of the classic sense of virtue is not that he has to be a man independent of ambition, but that the highest of ambitions or the highest of personal desires is to be remembered well. That's sort of that has to be a motivating factor for the president, right? That he's above being rewarded in monetary value, that he is playing for history. So how do we get this? How do we get somebody who's above Congress to put a check on Congress? And how do we create somebody extract an individual who's one of virtue and character and held highly in regard to the rest of the community? Now, monarchies solve one of these problems. The king is chosen by virtue of his parentage. So what that means in turn is that he's going to be, or she, the sovereign, is going to be above any legislative assembly. They're not part of the assembly. And in theory, they're going to be above factionalism as well. And that's sort of an inherent, if you've ever looked at the pageantry and stylistic over-the-topness of European monarchies, it conveys a sense that the sovereign is so elevated and high above everything that they can't be bought, that they represent the spirit of the nation, and which is why they're clothed in such grandeur. That's how monarchies solve this problem. However, the second issue, which is virtue, character, that's a roll of the genetic dice in a monarchy. Sometimes you're going to get sovereigns who are, men of high character, or women in the case of Elizabeth I. But then other times you're going to get, men of low character, like George IV. All right? So it's the monarchies solve only half of the two problems. Now, the good news for the founders in the summer of 1787 is that George Washington is sitting right there with the Virginia delegation. And the unstated expectation was that he would be the first president. And there's really nobody else who could even possibly challenge him to be president. And it was widely agreed that Washington would probably tap dance around running for president or admit that he would take the job if he was offered it, but that he would. So there's an unstated expectation there. And by the way, Washington at this point is only in his mid-50s. So, now it is the 1780s, but he's still, he's not a young man anymore, but he's not old like Benjamin Franklin. So that's good news. But it's not great news from a different perspective. Because one of the reasons I think that they spent so much time thinking through the Senate and slavery was because whatever compromises they were going to make, they had to work like right off the bat. Any system for finding future individuals of Washington's caliber won't actually have to work until Washington retires. So there's not necessarily the alacrity there. Now, I'm being speculative here, but I think that's an important thing to bear in mind, is that there's an assumption that we got the first president, and then this is, in a lot of respects, a future problem. Okay, so what's the starting point? Well, Madison in the Virginia Plan presents, and this is really just the sketch of an idea, and I actually think later on he opposes this at the convention. But the Virginia Plan, Madison's proposal, does have an obvious solution. You have the president chosen by Congress, but he only serves a single term, in this case 7 years. So that would, in theory, solve both of the issues. On the one hand, Congress would know who individuals of virtue and character and great wisdom would be, and they would hopefully pick somebody correctly, or at least they would do as good a job as anybody. And on the other hand, even though the president is being chosen by Congress, he's term limited. So he's not dependent upon Congress for the continuation of his job. So that could, in theory, create the necessary preconditions for the right kind of executive. But like I said, this is really just a blank space in the plan. And it admits of an immediate problem, which is, what about creating incentives for the president to do a good job? A one and done term doesn't really do that. And another issue, a related issue, is that, well, what if the president's a really good president? You really want to get rid of him, or you want to give him an opportunity to, be reelected? And also a president who's maybe doesn't have the character, virtue, and wisdom necessary to do a good job, regardless of what the political fates say. If he is facing the prospect of a defeat, that's going to create a motivation to give him a good job. So that, though, creates another problem. And the other problem is then, if we're going to admit the president to being reelected, then we can't have Congress choosing him. Because if he's getting reelected, then Congress is going to reelect him. He's not going to be any kind of check on Congress. He's going to be a creature of Congress. So you see the problem, that this is the way to think about the Electoral College, is where ultimately we're going with all of this, is the Electoral College is sort of a solution to this problem. And the problem basically boils down to, how do we create somebody independent of Congress to keep an eye on Congress and also make sure that the guy who gets the job is actually good, right? Okay, so if we're going to do re-elections, we can't go to Congress. Where do we go? Well, we could go to the state governments. Some people suggest that. Maybe we should have the governors choose the president. But that creates a similar problem with the Congress issue, which, if not even worse, which is that, look, if the governors are choosing the president and the president's up for re-election, who's he going to curry favor with? He's going to curry favor with the governors. And that's going to make him a creature of the state governments, which is worse than him being a creature of Congress, because the state governments have been the bad actors. Okay, so the state governments don't work. What about the people? Okay, that's kind of a yikes. And I know today, in modern sort of thinking, there is a general view that the people should choose the president. And I obviously subscribe to that. But it's important to understand that these individuals are not going to subscribe to that wholeheartedly. This is before the democratic revolution that really begins to take place in the 18-teens, 20s, 30s. There's a strong feeling that the people are capable of judging their own immediate interests. We talked about this a couple episodes ago, I think, with respect to the Senate, that they're good at judging their own immediate interests, but when policy problems are removed from their direct line of sight, when they're an order of abstraction to them, that they're going to struggle to handle the task. This is where this idea of refinement gets into play, which I talked about a couple of episodes ago, right? Is that the people are not going to be good at making decisions about what are for them abstract policy problems. But the people are good at finding high quality individuals in their community who do have that power. So there has to be a refinement process. That was the logic behind the Senate, and that's also going to be a logic behind the executive branch. There's another issue too. If you're going to let people vote for the presidency, you are going to run into the two problems that we've already talked about that they managed to solve. If you're going to have a democratic election for presidency, that's going to privilege the large states unless there's some kind of deal to be made. And if you're going to have a democratic election for the presidency, what are you going to do about the South? Right? Because the South is going to be privileged in the House of Representatives, but you'd have to design some sort of institution to keep them happy with the presidency. Because you can't just have the votes of Virginia stacked up against the votes of Pennsylvania. Now, that's not an insuperable problem. They actually talk about this for a while. I think James Wilson suggests, like, well, why don't we do like districts or something like that? But overall, there's a sense that the people are not going to be able to handle this. Okay, and here's the problem. So we've talked about Congress, we've talked about the state governments, we've talked about the people. That's no. Those are the only three institutions that they have on the table right now. Right? They have a Congress, they have the state governments, they have the people. Obviously, they're not going to use the courts. None of these institutions are going to work. This is where the Electoral College comes in. The Electoral College is a separate institution. It's even sort of a separate branch of government. You could call it a fourth branch of government that meets once every 4 years for a single day and has one power, which is to pick the president. When we see that as the Electoral College's purpose, and we see it as a way to select the president independent of Congress and find candidates who have manifest wisdom and virtue and character, a lot of the original design of the Electoral College begins to sort of fall into place. It makes sense. So, when think about this, the manner of choosing the Electoral College, it's left up to the state government. So right there's sort of a compromise. The state governments don't get to pick the presidents, but they get to pick the electors. And importantly, after the state governments, whatever manner they use to pick the electors, those electors are completely independent. Electors have complete sovereignty over their vote. They are, for all intents and purposes, they are as powerful as juries. Right? Juries cannot be second guessed on the facts. If an elector casts a vote for one person and on another, that's it. Okay. So you have a kind of independence here. Also, they meet in their state capitals, and they all meet in their state capitals on the same day. This is an important point because in their state capitals, they are away from congressional infighting and from the potential of congressional machinations and bribery and all of the sorts of like hanky-panky that Congress could potentially be engaging in. And if they're all doing their separate thing in every separate capital, it would be, from the perspective of 1787, impossible to stage manage a favored candidate that favors one faction or another. Okay. So they're also apportioned in the same way that Congress is apportioned. So every state gets electors equal to the number of House members they have plus the number of senators. So it's connected to the popular vote, but it also embodies the 3/5 compromise for the South, and it also embodies the compromise with the small states over the Senate, right? So Delaware is going to get 3 electors, so that's going to keep Delaware happy. Right. Now, there's another aspect to the Electoral College that I want to focus on here that I think has really cast its overall institution into a clearer light. It's one that was changed later on after the election of 1800. Every elector was to cast 2 votes for president, but only one of them can be from their home state. So we run into this periodically every couple of years. I think the last time this was an issue was in 2000 when George W. Bush named Dick Cheney to be his vice presidential candidate. And it was sort of an issue because Cheney was living in Texas and Bush was living in Texas, and the Constitution forbids the president and a ticket to be 2 people from the same state. I know that a lot of people might be like, well, why? That's really kind of stupid. But there was actually good reason for it. And I'll get into the details of that. So the original rule was not every elector casts 1 vote for president and 1 vote for vice president. That was changed in the 12th Amendment. The original rule was every elector casts 2 votes for president, and only one of them can be from the home state. So what's the logic of this? Well, the expectation was that electors would be partial to candidates from their own states. In other words, like favorite sons. And so if you gave every elector just 1 vote, and they choose a favorite son candidate, nobody will amount to a majority. So the idea behind giving them 2 votes, one of which is not from the state, is that 1 vote will be a favorite son, and the other one will be an individual of either national or regional esteem. And so it's almost sort of like in the second choice, for lack of a better term. The framers thought that the second choice would be where you would see the real national figures emerge, whose reputation is sufficiently impressive that people in other states acknowledge him, and that if enough people acknowledge that person, he would sort of emerge as the choice. Now, they also mandated that there had to be a majority. You have to win a majority of the electors, not a majority of the total vote, because remember, each elector gets 2 votes. You have to win a majority of the electors. And if there's no winner, the election goes to the House of Representatives, which is closest to the people. But every state gets 1 vote. So the large states cannot dominate the small states. And in that scenario, you would have a bargaining process where there would probably be negotiations and things like that. But importantly, whoever is chosen would still, to be reelected in 4 years' time, would have to win the Electoral College. And then the vice president finishes in second place. And again, the idea here is that he's a man of notable esteem. This is why Thomas Jefferson becomes John Adams's vice president in 1796. There's technically nothing in the Constitution that establishes that he'll become president. It was actually John Tyler when William Henry Harrison died in when William Henry Harrison died in 1841. John Tyler said, "Oh no, I'm the president now. Read me the oath of office." It wasn't until I think the 25th Amendment that this was formalized. So the vice president doesn't really have much of a role. They make him the presiding officer of the Senate. John Adams tries to turn that into something meaningful during his time in the vice presidency, but it doesn't work. Okay, so what is this? All of this supposed to do? So this is, to sum up, this is the Electoral College. So the state governments pick the manner. They pick the manner of choosing electors. Electors go to their state capitals on the same day. They all vote. They vote twice. Every elector gets 2 votes. Only one can be from their home state. You got to win a majority of the electors to become president. If nobody gets a majority, it goes to the House of Representatives. Each state gets 1 vote in the House. So like Virginia would have 1 vote. Delaware would have 1 vote. And the House keeps voting until somebody wins a majority. Okay. So what is all of this supposed to do? The basic vision here is it's supposed to accomplish those 2 tasks that I mentioned at the beginning. The first and probably most important is that it's designed to put the president above the factionalism of Congress. And so therefore he is capable of doing those 4 core functions that Hamilton talked about in Federalist 70. Protect against foreign attacks, manage foreign policy, make sure the law is steadily administered, protect private property, protect liberty against factions and combinations and ambition and anarchy. And also, by this sort of idea here, another factor as well is that the people elect the state governments who choose the Electoral College, who choose the president. So the president is tied to the people, but it's through a very refined process. There's 2 intermediary institutions between the people and the president. There's the state governments and there's the Electoral College. So it's meant to be very refined in terms of really weeding out nasty characters. It's still small r Republican, but it's meant to limit the extent to which public incompetence to make this choice is going to derail the process. So in theory, you have an independent president who is a man of character, virtue, and wisdom. Okay, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And today when we talk about the Electoral College, like I said at the beginning of the episode, people are complaining about the apportionment of electoral votes. We're not really talking about any of these institutions. Some of them still remain. The electors vote in their respective state capitals. The House still has the power to break ties. In theory, the state governments could revoke the popular vote for president. Those of you, maybe if you remember all the way back in the year 2000, as the recount was dragging on in Florida, there was talk from the Florida Republicans that the state legislature might just appoint electors. Whether or not the Supreme Court would let them do that is another matter, but under the Constitution, in theory, that's something that they could do. Okay. these things, nobody's getting rid of popular vote for president, and it doesn't really matter that electors meet in their state capitals. This is what I meant when it's a vestigial thing. Likewise, it's kind of a vestigial thing that the vice president and the president can't be from the same state. It's still in there, but it doesn't really matter. The system is gone. It's gone. So why? Well, there's a lot of reasons for why the system breaks down. But I want to focus on one. I want to sort of focus in on one particular idea here, which is that the framers, in a sense, wanted to create an institution that was high above what we today take to be politics. Right? Politics is the back and forth process of negotiation, but also, backbiting, conspiring, and blah, blah, blah that factions within the country engage in. Right? They wanted somebody to be above faction and above politics. And you can appreciate that with their level of refinement, right? The Senate has one level of refinement. The people choose the state governments who choose senators. The Electoral College has two. The people choose the state governments, which choose the Electoral College, which chooses a president. Right? But politics went ahead and grabbed the presidency, I think is probably the best way to put it. And a reason for that is that the office of the president turned out to wield a lot of power. It caught a lot of people by surprise. It did not catch Alexander Hamilton by surprise. It caught James Madison by surprise. Madison's expectation was that the president was going to be weak relative to Congress. And when Alexander Hamilton is named Secretary of Treasury in 1789, he becomes a sort of de facto prime minister, and the presidential office ends up having substantial influence over the course of public policy. And when factions begin to organize and create alliances and form into what we today know as political parties, they're going to go out and try to grab the presidency. That's really what political parties are. Parties are organized factions. In fact, the parties are really alliances among certain factions. Like, for instance, the Republican Party is a party, but it consists of multiple factions within it. For instance, there's a Christian evangelicals are in a factional alliance with small business owners, right? They have compatible preferences on issues. They have different priorities, but for the sake of American politics, they're in an alliance with each other. And that's what the parties are. They're sort of a stitching together of a variety of factions into parties. And the parties are not just going to let this office, with all of its vast powers, operate independent of politics. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this more in subsequent lectures, because the failure of the Electoral College to refine the presidential selection process and place it above parties is part of the essential story of how America is founded. So I don't want to just sort of like leave this here, because we're going to talk in later episodes about like the election of 1796, the election of 1800. Even we'll probably end up talking about the democratization of the presidency of all of these things. So this is not going to be the end of it, but I do want to give one historical illustration so you can appreciate just how quickly the Electoral College begins to collapse. And that is 1792. So this is the second election for president in 1792. By 1792, there are two identifiable factional alliances that you could call them parties depending on how strictly you want to use the definition. There's the Jeffersonian faction, which calls itself the Republicans. It's helmed by Thomas Jefferson. And it's also James Madison is involved in this. And then there is the Federalist faction, which is helmed by Alexander Hamilton. Again, it's not quite a party as it would be. They're still sort of forming. They're definitely identifiable. There's definitely a party interest forming. Now, that year in 1792, nobody was going to challenge George Washington for the presidency. Washington was still above parties in many respects. Washington usually, like when people say, oh, well, what political party was George Washington part of? They'll usually say Federalist. Washington did not see himself as a party man. Washington ends up in his second term sort of effectively migrating into the Federalist camp, but a lot of that had to do with miscalculations by Madison and Jefferson, and also very clever political maneuvering by Hamilton. As a matter of fact, Jefferson and Hamilton are on opposite sides of the political spectrum in 1792. They're both in Washington's cabinet, and they're both saying to him the same thing. You have to run again. You're holding the country together. Okay, so there's not a fight over there's not a fight over the presidency. There is a fight over the vice presidency. As a matter of fact, in 1792, you see the emergence of the political alliance that is going to characterize the Jeffersonians, and really for like the Democratic Party all the way into the 20th century, which is an alliance between Virginia, or in this case, the South, and New York. The Virginia Republicans reach out to the New York Republicans, and they basically make an alliance. And the issue is that they can't run Jefferson for vice president, or they can't run Jefferson for the presidency because electors are going to vote for Washington, who's from Virginia. They can't vote for Jefferson, who's also from Virginia. So they got to find somebody else. So the Virginians reach out to the New Yorkers and say, okay, we're going to vote for George Clinton, who's the governor of New York, for the number 2 spot. This is them competing for the vice presidency as early as 1792. The vice presidency wields no real power, and yet, nevertheless, it is an object of partisan wrangling as early as 1792. The feeling among the Jeffersonians was that they had to put themselves in a position to win the presidency if and when Washington retired, and so they had to push Adams out of the vice presidency because he felt like it was a Federalist. That's how early the Electoral College begins to malfunction. This is not what we should be seeing if the framers' original vision worked. And it just is. It's what we see. And ultimately, we'll talk about this election later on down the line as we get through our history, once we finish talking about the Constitution. But it really, by the year 1800, you have two fairly well-developed political parties contesting the presidency, and they basically break the Electoral College system. And as a consequence, it gets amended with the 12th Amendment, which mandates that electors have to vote for president and vice president. They don't get rid of the requirement that their 2 votes have to be from different states. So this is why, like, Dick Cheney had to move out of Texas before he was nominated. All right. So there's something worth thinking about here. I mean, we can look at this and say, okay, well, that was a dumb idea. And I think maybe there's an instinct to do that. But of course, hindsight is 20/20. And I also think another reason to sort of temper our critical judgment is that, nobody had really tried mass participatory democratic Republican politics in the history of the modern era. I mean, you'd have to go back to ancient Greece to see anything close to what they were planning to do here. Even with these processes of refinement, it's still a very open system of politics that they're creating. And they did not realize that political parties were going to become a thing. I mean, and it's fair to say, how could they know that? They were the first ones really doing this. Now, the British, sure, had political parties, but the view among the Americans was that the British system was fundamentally corrupt, and that the parties were a result of that corruption. And so having solved those problems, we're not going to have parties. That was their view. That was their hope. But of course, you couldn't do a comparative politics analysis, which you can do now, and look at, well, everywhere there's a democratic system in the world, you're going to have political parties. They didn't see that, right? So that's something to bear in mind about the, tempering our judgment about the framers for not choosing correctly. Another thing I would point out as well, and I think is a cause of a lot of our public unease, has to do with the fact that the president wields enormous power today. And we see this every day now with the Trump administration. We saw it with the Biden administration as well. I mean, the president just wields so much power, and he is not above faction. In fact, what he is he's a leader of one of the 2 factions within the country. And that is not in keeping with the founding ideal of the presidential office. And I think whatever we think about the founders' efforts to place the president above faction through the Electoral College, I think nevertheless, one of the things that we have lost sight of is the value and virtue of a president who is actually above the fray. We don't have that. And we never really had that. The difference is that up until the 20th century, the president was not the dominant player in the government. And the president wields unspeakable levels of power now. And what does it say about our system that the president wields so much power and that he does so on behalf of one of the major factions within society? That's a question. There's no answer to that question, but it is something I think that's worth thinking about. Okay, so that is going to wrap up this week's episode on the Electoral College. So just to sort of recap here, we've talked now about the compromise over the Senate, the compromise over slavery. We talked about today, it's not exactly a compromise, but kind of like feeling their way through to an admittedly, I think what you could call a Rube Goldberg solution to the presidential selection. Starting next week, we're going to look more at the logic of the Constitution rather than these various compromises that they had to work out where they kind of had to put logic to the side to make a deal. So the first thing we're going to look at next week is we're going to look at these two related concepts of separation of powers on the one hand, and on the other hand, checks and balances. They're not the same thing, but they're closely related, and it's a really interesting study to see how the framers adopt both of these simultaneously. I think it'll be a good episode. So finally, if you haven't already, I would ask you please consider subscribing to the podcast through your favorite streamer, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. And if you're able to and you're willing to, take a few minutes to write a review and comment on the podcast. 5 stars are always appreciated. Useful feedback is great, and 5 stars helps boost the signal of the podcast to help others who are interested in finding us. So that's it for this week, and we will see you next week.